Welcome back to Seeksan and welcome back to another video talking about athletic development, and this one is coming from a commenter on our How Can I Train My Neck video. It's coming from WD Law. Now the comment is too long to read out here, it's quite a little essay. Basically what WD Law is asking is, in America there seems to be this trend where it's highly encouraged for professional athletes to play a variety of different sports as young as possible, as many as possible, and then continue this trend for as long as they possibly can up until their professional career. Now, in this, he's arguing that this probably isn't really useful. What he's saying is that it's likely that talented athletes can probably play a variety of different sports, and it's not really necessary for him or those athletes, female or male, to play these variety of different sports because their talent is simply being exposed to these different sports, but they would have been good at these ones anyway, regardless if they actually played them. And they're wondering, is it a waste of time? What's their opinion on this? And should athletes try and play as many different sports? If you have children now at the moment and you're wondering what should I do with their athletic career or what way should I push them, we're going to tell you why you're correct in one part of your argument. It's that talented athletes are generally who are quite athletic. That kind of nebulous skill, that kind of existential skill is actually quite transferable, and you're correct in that statement. But regardless of your talent, it's actually very, very important for a lot of sports for young people developmenting all the way up and through until their later teens, depending on the sport, why they should play a lot of different sports and they should try as many of them as possible, and in some cases should continue playing some of them for as long as they possibly can, depending on what sport they're going into.
So definitely one of the larger kind of empirical reasons you'd want your child or you'd want the kid you're coaching to play as many sports as possible is that a few large scale studies have found later on in your sporting career you're much more resilient to injury. So a kid who plays 4 or 5 different kinds of sport in their kind of adolescence will be more resilient to injury if they're just playing one single sport when they're older. It makes a lot of sense. You're building up this kind of library of physical literacy. If you have somebody who is now playing soccer in their mid-20s, but they've happened to train in gymnastics when they were 12 or 13, obviously their ability to tumble, their ability to have very high levels of proprioception will be just that bit more refined than somebody who's played soccer for their entire life. This comes across in multiple different areas, so it's not just in proprioception, it's not just in the ability to absorb impacts, but it comes across in terms of resilience against high training load, comes across in terms of ligament and tendon health. So all of these things are kind of pointing towards the multi-sport athlete being a bit more resilient once they develop into an athlete to be able to train hard and compete very hard and kind of protect themselves against the risk of injury. But that being said, on the same side of that page is the biggest red flag from multi-sport athlete. The biggest reason parents and coaches don't want their kids and athletes training in multiple sports is the risk of injury for these kids when they're going through that developmental stage is much higher. The incidence of repetitive strain injury, the incidence of overtraining, the incidence of dropout from sport due to overtraining is much, much higher. So it's significantly higher in almost all studies in the multi-sport athlete than it is in the single sport athlete. So it is something you really have to kind of weigh up against one and the other. If you have a kid who's really competitive, really pushing hard in multiple sports at the same time, will it really matter if they're super resilient against injury in 6 or 8 years' time if they're no longer playing the sport, or if they've been injured and they're not able to play the sport anymore? So there's definitely swings and roundabouts, checks and balances kind of system here, but it's definitely not just great in one way, or it's definitely not bad in another way. Like we've come across a lot of parents who won't want their kids in the weight room, or they won't want their kids doing plyometrics, or they won't want their kids doing a second or a third sport because they're going to get overtrained. There's hundreds of thousands of kids playing multiple sports every year. They're very athletic because of it, and obviously the data would show that they're better able to become athletes in the future because of it. The next thing is that learning a skill is a skill in itself. So if you think learning a skill of kicking a football or tackling someone or throwing a punch learning that skill, you're obviously pushing towards becoming better at that physical movement, that kind of motor cognition element of learning, where you're learning the sequencing of muscle firing. You're learning about all those different pieces of afferent nerve signals feeding back to you. So how my elbow feels when it's fully extended. But the actual skill of learning can be really well developed. So you'll get some people who are just better at learning skills. This doesn't come about by mistake. It's not just something that you're born with. Nobody's really innately able to learn a skill better than somebody else unless there's some sort of neural issue or deficiency in the other person. Most of the time, people who are very good at learning skills have put themselves through learning multiple different skills over multiple different periods, and they become better at it. The way in which they become better at it is, and you'll have heard us talk about this a lot of times before, you can think about learning in 3 different phases, right? So you will have the first stage, which is the declarative phase of learning. If I was learning how to drive a car, and every time I go to change gear, I'll think about moving my hand onto the gear stick. I'll then think about pushing the clutch in. I'll then think about moving gear. I'll then think about leaving the clutch off and accelerating again. The second phase of movement, and this is where we can kind of skip ahead to, is called associative. So I'm chunking pieces of information together. Every time I move my hand onto the gear stick, I press the clutch. Every time I feel it hit that second gear or the next gear, I leave it off. When you get skilled learners, they're able to shrink that time that they're in the declarative stage for, and many of them are actually able to hop over the declarative stage, and they're able to chunk multiple pieces of information together. This makes sense in the way where if Gurf is now coming from international weightlifting and he is going into whatever, rugby, and he's lifting somebody in a line out, it makes perfect sense that Gurf will be able to chunk the piece of information like elbow lockout, hip extension together, because he's done those movements multiple times before. They're not the exact same, but he's been very skilled in a movement previously, and he's obviously going to be able to bring that experience and bring that learning into the next sport he plays.
We actually have a bone to pick with something you said there. You said people aren't really that much better at learning, but there's definitely people who are
born better,
physically literate, for example.
But the physical literacy in research isn't shown to be innate within people. People are born with fairly similar levels of physical literacy. It's just what you do when you're a baby, and what you do when you're a very small child. Like you can.
That seems unlikely. Can't imagine why skill learning would be any different than your genetic talent.
Yeah.
Like why wouldn't? I'm sure Michael Jordan was faster picking up throwing hoops than I would have ever been.
But then I wonder how much movement Michael Jordan did as a baby.
Yeah, but I'd say it would seem incredibly unlikely that skill learning would be just completely uniform.
I definitely think there's genetic traits that make people better.
Yeah.
But there's also definitely some people who are innately going to be pushed more towards physical movement and learning physical movements, and then there's going to be some kids and babies who are going to be pushed towards not really doing anything. It's the same reason why you want kids to be throwing and catching with both hands. And you're like, what difference does this make? It's just a baby. But like the neural development you can get and the development of their actual neural system starts being pushed in one direction or the other since the time they're born.
I'm just saying that someone's level is almost certainly higher than other people's levels.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Like Clarence's level is higher than any 5 people you meet on the street. Like it's just
But I wonder how much that was influenced by Clarence coming out of the womb, and how much it was influenced by Clarence as a baby.
I'd say there's just still straight out of the womb, like there's just different levels.
There'd have to be.
I can't see how there wouldn't be.
Yeah.
Like. Anyway, moving on to the next aspect of why young people and up to a certain stage, maybe mid-teens, even late teens, depending on what sports you're playing, is children should definitely play a variety of different sports as a form of self-talent IDing. So if you play a load of different sports, for example, let's say, take me, baby Gurf, right? I played, due to the nature of the country and the culture, a lot of the sports I played would have been highly aerobic, highly endurance-focused sports, and something I was definitely not predisposed towards, and something I thoroughly just did not enjoy. A lot of these were heavily predisposed towards long distance running, high aerobic capacity, 90-minute games, 80-minute games, Gaelic football, handball, swimming, stuff like this. Stuff that I just wasn't really predisposed to at that age. Whereas I was exposed to a variety of different sports, but all of these were trending in this direction. Now, Some of this is self-limiting due to the environment, but a lot of it is available to you if you kind of make that effort for your kids. For example, if you can push them to different things. For example, if I'd found things like wrestling, maybe different forms of track and field, maybe shot putting, if I'd found weightlifting younger, it would expose me a lot sooner to a better athletic talent, or a sooner put me in a direction for a sport that I would have been more destined towards, or more physically capable for, and innately capable from birth. So with this, if you have those options as a younger person, is to play a variety of different sports to really maximize what kind of sport you would be best at. And it's important for you to continue this on, because the developmental stages can drastically change what you're exposed to. Now, for the 1% or the 1% of the 1%, a lot of times you'll see these are from the age of like 8 or 9. These are destined for the sport and they'll know immediately. For example, Ilya Ilyin, for example, talks about when he came into the gym when he was 8 years old with his brother. The coach immediately said, "This is the one I've been waiting for. This is the kid. You're the one I've been waiting for." So for those 1% of the 1%, they'll immediately know what you're destined for. But for example, let's say if you take basketball as they're growing up, you might have someone who could be incredibly short and might not hit a growth spurt until they're like 14 or something, and then massively shoot off in direction. Or we can have vice versa. We can have people who are well ahead of the curve in terms of height differences until they're 14. They'll be like, "Fuck, I'm so desperate for basketball. This is it." And they'll get to 5'11" when everyone's 14, and then they stop growing, and everyone else overtakes them in terms of that. So you need to keep playing for a certain period of time, because we need to see what happens through these developmental stages, what you'll end up really being destined for once your molds kind of started or kind of finished in certain areas. You know, for example, like rugby, you might be a bigger kid for ages 10 to 12 and you'll think rugby's it for me. Then you get to 14 and you stop gaining weight and everyone else shoots on beyond you. So it's very, very important for these multi-sports to be tried, so you understand what you like and you understand what you're destined for. One of the most interesting things with children and young athletes is the likelihood of staying in a sport is if they're better at it. If they enjoy a sport, they will stay in a sport a lot longer and more likely continue with it. And you usually enjoy a sport if you're good at it. Very rarely do kids, now adults are different, but kids and young teens will almost always stay in a sport that they like. Very rarely do they stay in a sport they don't enjoy doing, and this is almost always related to their talent with it. No one enjoys doing something that they're bad at. As you get older and turn into an adult, you go, I'm bad at this, but I'm getting a different kind of enjoyment with this. Kids and young teens are very self-conscious about this kind of development, so it's very, very important that you try multiple different sports so we can really identify which one of these is important for you and which one you're talented for. Now this feeds into our next point of why you should play a variety of different sports. It is because different sports have different stages of specialization. For example, if you are destined to be a pro soccer player at the age of 12, 13 or 14, you'll probably be heavily aware if you're going to be a pro soccer player. Scouts, talent ID systems will identify you as this, and there is literally no reason for you to continue playing rugby, basketball and different kinds of wrestling and martial arts when 14 if you're destined to be a pro or semi-pro or elite soccer player. You just need to play this highly skilled sport and then continue on with your career in soccer. But for example, like we talked about the issue of rugby, your physical development really depends and will not really expose itself until you're in your mid to later teen years. So there's a lot of benefits, like some of the ones we've already mentioned, where you're getting these benefits for rugby and you need to keep testing the waters with other sports in case your physical development limits you later in life at rugby, because realistically, for a lot of rugby players, their talent won't be exposed until they kind of hit the end of their puberty or kind of the latter 2/3 of puberty. Now, some lads will be over 6'2". What's the height when you're playing rugby where you'll automatically get a child at Munster? It's over 6'6", isn't it?
6'6", I think, yeah.
So, for example, in for Munster trials in rugby, if you're over 6'6", you automatically get a child at rugby. But for the vast majority of rugby players, they're not 6'6". So it's very important that you keep testing waters, keep your fingers in other pies as you move on through. So just in case you get to 17, you're fast and you're athletic, but you thought you're destined for rugby, but suddenly your weight gain is heavily limited. You're 70 kilos when everyone else is now 95 to 105 plus kilos. You need to understand then, maybe I'm better off going into athletics like I've been doing all along, or maybe I'm better off doing shot put like I was destined for, or I had some talent for. So it's very, very important that in the specialization side of things, you need to analyze that sport and you need to be aware of which one it is. So for example, swimming as well is a very early specialization for it due to the amount of volume of training. You'll see a lot of swimming. The kids will be literally doing 2-3 hour sessions 5-6 days a week in the morning, And this also seems to be highly necessary, and you need to build up this volume of training as early as possible. Similar to weightlifting. With weightlifting, after the age of maybe 12, 13, 14, if you're destined for weightlifting, these other sports will heavily help you as a child, as an infant, toddler, and then kind of preteen gymnastics that are aerobic based. All of that will help weightlifting. But once you get to the age of kind of 12 for weightlifting, there really is no need to continue other sports. Specialization into weightlifting along with smart GBP work will carry you all the way, and it's time to just keep going with that. So this kind of really helps you ID what you're good at, but it also helps you ensure that you end up in a sport that you could have. Because if we got to 17, you've stopped growing, you're 6 foot, everyone else is in the destined for the NBA, and everyone else is 6'7" plus or whatever, you're kind of left in a shit or bust scenario if you could have played a different sport at 6 foot. But if you'd stopped playing those years ago and put all your eggs into one basket, then you were kind of left with nowhere to go with your athletic career, even from a non-pro aspect, just from a self-enjoyment and kind of a hobbyist side of things, even though I said I hate the word hobby. But if you've left all these behind when you might not have been destined for that sport, even though you didn't realize it, you're kind of left nowhere. So it's important for just as an individual is to keep playing these sports as well, just in case that you might have actually ended up being very talented at a different sport, even though you may have seemingly been headed towards a specific sport.
Before you comment down below as well, with the Jimmy Van Clerk was 5'3" and won a World Cup with whoever. We're talking about obviously broad strokes here, vast amounts of people. And you always want to play the averages game. Like, nobody wants to be the exception.
You'll know if you're the exception.
Yeah, of course you'll know.
Because you walk into a gym and people are like, you're the one I've been waiting for.
Yeah, so don't, just before you're like, oh, this guy played in the NBA and he was great and he was 5'8". The other thousands of people were not 5'8".
Sorry, I just actually want to add something there as well. Even experienced coaches will get this wrong. I've been wrong quite a few times with weightlifting, and I've stopped saying it now because I've seen someone start weightlifting over the years and I'm like, this person is going to be so fucking good at weightlifting. You look at their muscle conformation, their athletic ability, their mental drive, and you'll be like, this person is going to be unbelievable at weightlifting. And more often than not, I've been very wrong with it.
Yeah,
it's crazy. So you look at their raw athletic talent, raw weightlifting talent, you'll be like, this person's going to be great, and then you'll see them not really get there. So even for experienced coaches, this can be very, very, very difficult to see.
Yeah. Going on from Gerf's last point there of like that kind of mental drive, definitely one of the major advantages in athletes when they play a lot of sports is that their development of their kind of mental or their psychological game tends to be a hell of a lot better. So if you take in any changing room, in any team environment, you're going to have 4 or 5 different kind of psychological profiles that are working in there. You'll tend to have the real team player leadership mentality. You'll have a number of players in that section. You'll definitely have the kind of out on their own lone wolf person. You'll definitely have the person who likes to play well with a team but doesn't like to speak up around others or just wants to focus on his or her own game. There's multiple different psychological profiles working within almost every team sport, and even within every individual sport you'll find these different personalities. The main thing that playing different sports offers us is it offers us a glimpse at more athletes. It offers us rubbing shoulders with more athletes and coaches, and now suddenly we can see, okay, this amount of discipline is what I need. This amount of grit, resilience, motivational drive, concentration, focus. You just get your eyes open to a hell of a lot more. If you take, for example, you get somebody who's only ever played tennis and they train with their tennis coach every day. There's no shouting in the tennis club. There's no kind of losing the head at any point. You don't ever really have to draw your attention back in and focus on a particular point. If that person only ever goes along that line, right? So they're never in a hugely adversarial environment. They mightn't have people shouting from the crowd. They mightn't have their opponent shouting at them. If that person was to also have played a martial art where they're involved in martial arts fights, they might have coaches shouting from the sideline. They might have supporters shouting from the sideline. They can then build up a level of resilience against that. And now suddenly when they go to a slightly more competitive level, or they might be playing tennis at a senior level, Now they're suddenly able to bring in that kind of different tool they brought from another sport. My most hated saying is they'll take that tool from their toolbox.
The worst.
But anyway, they'll have that tool. They'll be able to draw their focus back in and concentrate on what they're trying to do. I've seen this hundreds of times with athletes, and particularly with the kind of more adult onset of training, where you have somebody who might have played a bit of sport as a kid, they haven't trained for years and years and years, and suddenly they come into the gym and they start lifting weights. You'll be able to notice within 5 minutes if the person has had some sort of exposure to sport before. You'll see it in the way their gear is organised. You'll see it in the way they conduct themselves during a warm-up, and you'll see it in the way they kind of play through the things that happen during the session after the session. The mental development you get from playing a lot of sports cannot be understated. And the other thing is this mental development happening when we're a bit younger, when we're in our kind of early teen years, when that mental plasticity or that neural plasticity is a small bit higher, is just very, very advantageous. Moving on from that point then, and something that dovetails in quite nicely, is that level of development that happens in our early adolescence and our mid-adolescence can be ramped fairly aggressively. So if I have somebody and they've never trained before and they come into the gym in their 30s, it's going to be very difficult for me to increase their VO2 max by 15%. Let's just pick a number, 15% to increase their VO2 max. That will be difficult, it will take quite a long time, and it will involve a lot of pain and a lot of training. If I get that same person, they're 15 years old, they're in all right shape, but they still haven't really been training, just their hormonal profile makes it so much easier to bring about that 15% change in VO2 max. And this goes across aerobic training, anaerobic training, skills training. Due to the fact that that person is physically developing at the same time, you have this suite of growth hormone, testosterone, everything is there, and it's in the correct ratios and the correct proportions. You couldn't juice an adult to be in the correct way or correct hormonal profile for these kind of levels of development. So it is important that you push athletes quite hard when they're younger if you want to get very, very high levels of performance when they're older.
The next point is in relation to programming and kind of long-term athletic development. So a lot of times we've talked on this channel about periodization and going through specific blocks of training. Now, it's not as cut and dry as like this block of training, and then going to a peaking phase. But the general principles of periodization are very, very important and well established and work quite well. So taking those kind of principles of periodization in a short term compared to an athlete's career, if we take 1 year and we periodize that out, I want you to think about that in terms of an athlete's entire developmental career. So we start from the age of like 5 all the way up to 35. If we zoom really far out, imagine these early stages of development as a child through preteen, through kind of mid to late teen. These are different stages of that periodization over a long-term career. So these initial years are that base of that triangle. Like Fitz talking there with the aerobic development, anaerobic development. When we're going through a prep phase, for example, for most athletes, we're trying to develop all of these skills universally to a certain extent, a very, very minimal certain extent, and then we really push one of these specific skills that they need for their sport. Same way, we zoom really far out, we get that same aspect with an athlete's entire career. So think of multi-sports as a large long-term periodization training system, whereas if we do, for example, if we're going to rugby, if we do a lot of soccer, we might get a lot of aerobic development and anaerobic development. If we do a lot of martial arts, we'll train fast twitch fibers as well. We'll train, the cognitive benefits. We'll train the awareness benefits. All of these will be developed to a minimal developmental necessary skill for later in those sports. So it's kind of almost like different stages of programming. But obviously, as we talked about, for the other reasons why you don't want to specify too early with your specific training, you would never really be able to program all of these aspects into as an efficient and enjoyable fashion for the young children if they've just played a variety of different sports. They'll get this base of that periodization triangle and will benefit them even more as they get older and they specialize at the top triangle later in their career.
The last thing then, and this is probably important to note, if you look at good athletes in adult life, they tend to have been good at that sport in their mid and late teens. a very, very big advantage of playing multiple sports at the same time is you get this thing, you could call it concurrent development, right? So we'll take, for example, the soccer player who also is playing rugby as well, or they might be a GAA player who's also doing weightlifting in their off season. Due to the fact that you get these peaks and troughs in development over the course of a teenager's teen years or an athlete's teen years, there'll be certain times when it's better for them to be pushing their aerobic work, and there's certain times where it's better for them to be pushing their strength work. There's no real way of planning this out. There's no way of knowing for a fact that between April and August this athlete is going to be really well disposed to high volumes of training. You just kind of have to slowly teeter their way through and fluctuate those volumes until you kind of find a period where you can push hard, and then you have to drive that athlete on. If you take athlete A as one example, they're just playing soccer. They play soccer for the whole year. Their season starts in January and their season finishes in July. But then you have athlete B who is playing soccer, and then from maybe August through to December they're playing rugby with their local team as well. What you'll find is, due to the different demands of these two very different sports, that rugby player might be doing a small bit more work on strength. It might be doing more work on speed than if he was doing soccer. So they're coming into rugby season with a higher level of speed training than the people who have just played rugby. They're then going back into a soccer season where they have a higher level of strength or power outputs than the people who just play soccer. And now slowly the mean of all of these different aspects of their fitness is coming up. So it's not without sacrifice. It's not without them having to train very hard, put in a lot of hours of training, but they definitely get a better level of development over the course of their kind of teen years, due to the fact that they're just being pushed a small bit harder across multiple different facets or factors of their strength.
So there's a lot to take in there in regards to that video. There's a lot of different principles. There's a lot of different reasons why these athletes should be doing that. It's not something you really need to worry about. It's something that is too late for a lot of people. It's too late for everyone watching this if you didn't do it, and it's already happened for you if it has, so don't worry about it too much. If you have kids and they do seem to be athletically inclined, then for several years definitely encourage them to do that. We're actually going to do a specific video on youth development. This is more on why you should play multiple sports. There's a couple of different things that'll be probably out next week or the week after on the specific principles around youth development, because a lot of people have asked for that, so we'll get to that as well. So if you have kids and stuff and you coach youth athletes, we'll have some stuff coming out of that to give you some ideas to think about. So if you enjoyed this video, let us know. To help the algorithm, if you could name all the sports you played as a kid, that would be very, very useful. I'll go first. I did Gaelic football, handball, racquetball, swimming, taekwondo, a little bit of fucking cross country, and
Your dalliance into cross country.
Teeny, no, that horse riding doesn't even count because I didn't do that as a sport, but I learned how to ride a horse, and I think that's it.
I did hurling, football, soccer, rugby, badminton, tennis. Did I do anything else?
7 seems to be the sweet spot. 7 seems nice.
You saying that because I did 6.
Yeah, but you didn't do enough.
Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you again soon.